Today's TMJ4, this is 4-1 Forward.
Well, it is a must-read, especially if you live or rent in Milwaukee. This week, the author of a book about evictions won the prestigious Pulitzer Prize in nonfiction.
The book, titled Evicted, Poverty and Profit in the American City, centers around 8 Milwaukee families and the struggles they've had with affordable housing. And the book has started a healthy public policy discussion about poverty and profit.
So we are so thankful to have Raphael Ramos here with Legal Action in Wisconsin to talk about this book and really the bigger issue of evictions. Now, you're not the author of the book here, but tell me about what role did your organization have in this narrative?
Sure. Well, the book, came out last year, and as part of his preparation for the work, doing the research, Professor Desmond reached out to Legal Action because we are one of the few legal service providers who do housing work for low-income tenants in the city. So a lot of our attorneys helped do helped him with the research when studying up on the eviction problem.
Is that where he came up with the number 1 in 8 Milwaukee renters, they experience at least one forced eviction or a landlord had foreclosed. So is that where he got the number from you guys?
Yeah, I mean, he actually did a lot of the research himself. That was one of the things that I think he realized, was that there was this gap in terms of the information available on eviction. So he accumulated that information and then worked with our attorneys to learn more about the sort of the legal process and how things work. What
does this story tell, and is it unique to Milwaukee?
It definitely tells a story of how everyday people live in the city, the challenges they face.
People who are on the edge, people who are struggling financially.
Absolutely, yeah. And it's definitely not something that's unique to Milwaukee. The book is nice because all the research was done in Milwaukee, and the stories it tells are stories of Milwaukee residents, Milwaukee's people. But it's the same sort of story you'll see in any metropolitan area where people who have low income, little access to resources, really live on a knife's edge in terms of access to legal aid, legal assistance, and just poverty and homelessness.
How much they're spending. The average person is usually a third of their salary.
That's usually what they say, right? Only
and this one, it's said about
more than half, sometimes 3/4.
Sometimes up to 70% of their salary.
Yeah, I mean, the vast majority of people's income, of a lot of low-income tenants, income goes towards rent, which makes it hard to live. When you think about it, if in terms of proportion of income versus what you're spending on rent, one bad week, you miss 1 week because you have the flu, and all of a sudden you can't make rent.
Right.
And then you get the notice of eviction, and then before you know it, you're on the street.
So how does this book sort of move the ball forward? How does it help the discussion on the public policy issue?
Sure. Well, I think the book did a good job putting a human face on this sort of abstract issue. When people talk about eviction, I don't think people realize how common it is in different cities. In Milwaukee, depending on the numbers you look at, it's 12,000 to 16,000 evictions filed a year. In other cities, we've seen it's as high as 33,000 per year.
Wow.
And those are just staggering numbers, and it equates to, I think it's around 40 evictions per day. That's nonstop, every day of the week, or weekday, so Monday through Friday, all afternoon.
And most of the people who are affected, that they said were women, right?
Yeah.
Who have children.
Yeah, I think Professor Desmond described eviction, the face of eviction, as being young, single African-American women. And that's something we've seen. We run the Eviction Defense Project in the courthouse, and a lot of our clients have been single mothers, young women who don't have much, in terms of experience with rental, with home ownership, that sort of thing.
The subtitle on this is Poverty and Profit. So what is the larger issue here? What is going on with folks who are trying to rent?
Yeah, I think one of the issues that is happening is that people, when they're not getting the rent, landlords, will oftentimes go to eviction as their immediate resource to address a sort of non-payment issue. This presents a big problem for tenants because once an eviction is filed in court, that record becomes publicly available, and it becomes harder for people to find a new place to live if they have been evicted.
It's a mark on your financial situation, and so when you try to go to the next place.
Yeah, exactly. So it really sends people down this downward spiral of poverty, leads you to move. You can't find nice housing because a reputable landlord won't take you, so you have to go to a different situation.
It says many people get sick and depressed.
Exactly, exactly. And the worse your housing situation becomes, the harder it becomes for you to live. I mean, if you live in a place where the conditions are terrible and you don't feel like you can rent, a lot of people make the mistake of not paying rent at all instead of withholding part. And then they're evicted. And then that leads them to another worse situation.
And then what happens to that city block? What happens to that building? And then the bigger effect of it.
Exactly, yeah, and what happens to those people? So you think about the people being evicted.
Right.
It's young women with kids, it's families. So children who are forced to move schools, constantly changing their educational pathway. And that really doesn't set them up for a strong, future. It really poses some barriers for them.
As you mentioned, this problem is not unique to Milwaukee, but the book setting is in Milwaukee. What are some of the lessons then that we can learn from this?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that Professor Desmond really highlighted with the book was that representation is important for landlords and tenants. That becomes important once you've been evicted. But one other thing that I think the book kind of reminds people about is that if it's possible to work something out before the eviction's filed, that's critical too, because it really helps people avoid getting that mark on the record. I'm
glad you brought that up, because we want to talk more about that particular part. What happens if you become evicted? What happens if you are in that situation? So coming up on 4-1 Forward, what are your legal rights as a tenant?
We will walk through what you need to know to avoid being evicted. Plus later on 4